Okay, so I will also start the recording.
Yeah, the instructions were clear, so go ahead, please.
Perfect. So I'll start the recording so I can send it to you afterwards, and you can share it with anyone who wasn't able to attend. And I can get started. Okay. Welcome everybody to this training session focused on M002, so methodology for terrestrial forest conservation on V1.0.2. So this is the second training session as part of this training series. So I will be, so both Daniel Ortiz and I will be delivering this training. I will be in charge of delivering the first part, and my colleague Daniel will deliver the second part. So as a reminder, I am the Auditing and Operations Associate at Equitable Earth, and Daniel is our methodology lead focused on M002. So as a quick reminder, this training is meant to introduce you on the methodology and its associated procedures, as well as to technically train on key procedures and requirements and to align on our quality expectations. So this is also a reminder that we're introducing general concepts to get a sense of how we do things at Equitable Earth and how this might differ from other carbon crediting programs. But we still remain, of course, quite high level, and all the concepts that we tackle in this training are further detailed in the documentation, which is available on our website. So we highly recommend to consult this. And it's also worth noting that we're still in the process of operationalizing this methodology internally. So there may not be full clarity on some points of this presentation. We can tackle any questions at the end, if any, and anything pending will be clarified in the future, and of course, before the first mandate is assigned. And also worth noting that this is not meant to be a training on like the baseline setting approach specifically, but on M002 requirements and procedures in general. So with all of this in mind, we will be using the same type of active participation as the first session. So we'll be using ongoing polls throughout the presentation, and we have dedicated Q&A sessions as well. So same as before, the polls can be found in the bottom right corner of your screen, either through the symbols or through a dotted square. And then you can find the current polls when we launch them, and then you can leave some questions in the Q&A. So you can either leave them and we'll get to them in each Q&A section, or you can just ask them during the dedicated time. You can ask them live, so up to you. So this training, as I said, is split in two parts with a 10-minute break in between. The first part will be focused on eligibility criteria and general requirements across the ecological condition and carbon pillars that I will be presenting. And the second part, presented by Daniel, is focused on the quantification methods of GHG emission reductions. So this is a quick overview. Now jumping straight into the introduction. So again, this is M002 is a much like a RED+ methodology that is focused on terrestrial forest conservation. And that only covers avoided unplanned deforestation and degradation activities. So it was developed with inputs from indigenous people in local communities, and it was shaped by about 60 stakeholders, spanning indigenous leaders, scientists, conservationists, community experts, et cetera. And it was also informed by established developers on the market to address some long-standing implementation challenges and blockers. So hopefully this is a fully fleshed methodology that can help break some of the market obstacles. So just a couple numbers. So we have currently about 20 million hectares in the pipeline worth of project. That is split across pretty much more or less 20 developers. So this is to give you an idea. And this pipeline is split between different stages of project development. So conversion from lead to feasibility stage, design phase. So there's many different formats. And in terms of a reminder of the program structure, so in the first section, this was the topic of the training. so the program manual and the Equitable Earth standard. And we're now jumping into M002 specifically. M001 will be another dedicated session, which we can do through a recorded session sent to you. And so we're focusing specifically on this methodology today. So without further ado, let's jump into eligibility criteria for this methodology, which are split between scope, nesting, lens status, geographic boundaries, and temporal boundaries. And I will deep dive into each one of them. So this methodology, as previously mentioned, only supports AUDD activities in a defined project crediting area. And this is in turn to, the goal is to target the root causes of both deforestation and degradation. So this said, this version of the methodology effectively excludes anything related to avoided planned deforestation and degradation, sustainable management of forest, enhancement of forest carbon stock. So it's exclusively focused on AUDD activities. As part of this, in terms of the nesting of projects, so each project must use an AUDD baseline, which is allocated by Equitable Earth. This is much like VM 48 if you've already been trained on that, or if you're used to this methodology. So we allocate baseline through a risk map process, which is derived from a jurisdictional reference level. So to try and deconstruct this, so risk maps pretty much means that project's baseline is assigned based on the forecasted risk of degradation and deforestation over the crediting area on a per pixel basis, with data that we get from our AGB providers. And the jurisdictional reference level is a jurisdiction-wide estimation of the total possible AGB loss over a 5-year period based on a historical reference period of AGB loss on that same jurisdiction. So I will let Daniel to deep dive into this topic in the second part, but this is pretty much what is important to remember at this stage is that the JRL is what acts as the emission reduction budget for a jurisdiction to avoid overcrediting of projects. All this to say that we assign those baselines, and under this version of the methodology, standalone baselines provided by developers are not allowed. This is important to keep in mind. Second point is that this JRL needs to be validated by an independent expert panel, so third-party validated in accordance with a jurisdictional baseline validation methodology, which, if you remind from the introduction, this is something that is forthcoming. So we are in the process of operationalizing this. It is not fully fledged and we don't have it yet, but it will be available when we start validating the first project. So, and VVBs like ANOR may use this third-party evaluation to inform their assessment, but do not need to validate nor the JRL or the risk maps at validation. This is an important precision. In terms of the land status for projects to be eligible, so what we apply is at least a 90% forest coverage over the project crediting area at baseline. Under this methodology, we use a forest definition that is adapted from the FAO, which defines forest as land spanning more than 0.5 hectares with a canopy cover of more than 10%. So we also allow alternative forest definitions under certain circumstances, and that's all detailed in the methodology. Projects must also be located within at least one clearly defined jurisdiction for which a risk map is available, so for which we have developed a risk map. Again, the full list of risk maps available are on our website in the M002 section, so you can see it's regularly updated, so you can see which risk maps are available. This is more relevant to developers, but if you're interested, you can refer to that list. In terms of inclusion, so projects can be developed over public, private, communal, or mixed lands, including IPLC land or not. and they can be developed within or outside protected areas as well. So with all of this said, this methodology effectively excludes any mangrove ecosystem, marine and coastal habitats, peatlands, and monoculture forest plantations. So some of these might be available in a future version, but at this stage, we're unable to certify projects under these ecosystems. Now on to the geographic boundaries. So the conditions for projects to be eligible include so forest areas that are at risk of unplanned deforestation and degradation in the baseline scenario. Developers cannot exclude any forest areas within the project area, with the exception of plantation forest, as mentioned in the previous slide, that must be excluded from project crediting area. Projects can be of any size, of course, with this minimum of 0.5 hectares to match the forest definition. And project areas may also be expanded throughout their crediting period. This is quite basic, nothing too tricky. And in terms of the temporal boundaries, so the crediting period project remains 40 years. But developers must clearly define the temporal boundaries for the project area by specifying the period during which deforestation and degradation impacts are mitigated by project activities. So this is mentioned in the PDD by developers. I will, if you can keep this question for the dedicated Q&A slide, which will come in a bit, that would be great. So we can continue with the flow of the presentation, but I will happily answer some questions in the next few minutes. So let's start with the first poll. That is quite straightforward. Again, nothing too tricky. I will launch it so you can access it in the poll section. And the question is, are developers allowed to produce their own baseline for allocation under M002? So hopefully everyone can access this poll. I'm seeing some votes coming in. It seems like yes. Again, as a reminder, it's on the bottom right corner of the screen in the meeting tools. And then you can access polls and it should pop up. I'll wait a few minutes. Getting 4 votes in. All right, number is increasing. I think there's alignment, so I will end the poll from here. Everybody answered no, which is correct. So baseline allocation is done by Equitable Earth, and we don't allow to produce for developers to produce their own baseline. Thank you for doing this. I will now move to any questions. I saw there was one. I don't know if you left it in the Q&A section or if you want to speak up. Or maybe this question is now open.
Yeah, I have one question regarding the eligibility and related to the forest definition you mentioned. What is the time frame for the forest to be defined as eligible? Meaning from the project start backwards, is it like 10 years, like other standards, or?
Yeah, exactly. So we look at a 10-year historical reference period. We'll have some time to deep dive into this in the next few slides. But we look at a 10-year period during which the project crediting area must have maintained at least 90% forest coverage. So yeah, it's effectively 10 years.
Okay, thank you.
Of course. If we don't have any other, I'm checking the Q&A section, but I think we don't have any other questions. So we can move on to the ecological condition requirements. So we'll focus on principles first and then on some methods that are required by M002. So basic principles is that developers must implement project activities that achieve positive ecological outcomes, minimize risks, and mitigate negative socio-environmental impacts. That is quite straightforward. Those activities must also be targeted towards conserving areas identified as high risk of deforestation and degradation, as well as areas that are considered high conservation value. And those activities must also promote local ownership by involving indigenous people in local communities where applicable, of course, and involve IPs and LCs throughout the project design and implementation. So there are, so ecological condition interventions must be articulated around three main buckets, which are ecosystem extent and connectivity, ecosystem services, and ecosystem threats. So as part of the first bucket, so developers through their projects must maintain and increase ecosystem extent and connectivity and mitigate human-made barriers that fragment or hinder connectivity. So this must be done by limiting or mitigating the impacts of infrastructure development or land use change. So some examples of actions to maintain extent and connectivity can span from maintaining minimum corridor width, establishing new corridors, establishing or maintain buffer zones, remove barriers like roads. So there's many different examples based on the project context. And in some specific contexts, if some project activities lead to the creation of new barriers, developers must assess the impact of doing so and justify the need for it in extreme cases. In terms of ecosystem services, so developers need to maintain access to ecosystem services when the livelihoods of IPs and LCs depend on them. Developers must also ensure that access to any non-timber forest products and derived benefits is fair, transparent, and non-discriminatory. This is mainly done through a benefit sharing arrangement. And if NTFPs are generated within the project area, developers must identify any unsustainable practices and encourage sustainable management. As for ecosystem threats, so developers must identify, analyze, and strive to reduce both anthropogenic drivers of degradation and natural threats to deforestation and degradation, as well as overall ecosystem condition in the project area. Of course, this must be done in a context-specific manner based on the drivers of degradation and natural threats in the specific jurisdiction or biome. And developers must leverage historical data as well as local expertise and active engagement with stakeholders, namely IPs and LCs in the area. So as you can see, there's a strong focus on IPLC engagement throughout the requirements. Some example of threats, of course, quite basic, but anthropogenic threats can include land conversion for agriculture, infrastructure development, overgrazing, etc. And natural threats can span invasive species, uncontrolled fires, soil erosion, etc., etc. That is, again, context specific based on the project area. As for the methods, so the baseline assessment, the ecological baseline assessment to inform design of project activities must be based on specific methods. So we require a field assessment, as well as desktop research and assessments and active engagement with relevant stakeholders based on the project context. And this ecological condition baseline must be done across the categories shown on this slide. So reminding what we just said, ecosystem extent, function, services, and threats. We're quite flexible on the indicators and metrics used, but developers are encouraged to monitor multiple indicators and metrics across each of those categories. And developers must justify the selection of each metric and indicator, of course, and state why they are representative based on the ecological condition of the project area. So following up on the previous slide, we're just doing a zoom on this first method for ecological baseline assessment, which is the field assessment, which is quite specific to our program. And so developers must design and conduct a field assessment to gather this data to inform the baseline assessment and then to monitor the performance of ecological condition based on the established project targets, outcome, and objectives in the project area. And all of this must be completed using the Equitable Earth certification platform that we had introduced in the previous training. So the first step is that Equitable Earth provide a stratification of the project area to support the field assessment. So the developer provided us with the shapefiles, the polygons of the project area, and we get back to them with a stratification. So the stratification is based on three main categories. So the risk of deforestation and degradation in the project crediting area, the distance to forest the forest boundaries, and the distance to the forest edge. All of these inputs creates this field assessment stratification map, which we provide in such a format to developers. So it's a map of their project area. This is an example with some different categories based on the risk as well as the distance to forest edge and just the forest edge in general across the project area. So one thing to specify is that the field assessment here is the only purpose is for ecological condition assessment, and it doesn't have and won't have implications on the AUDD baseline setting. So we require it. So the field assessment is required and is not meant to be a field calibration tool for carbon stocks, but only a tool for ecological condition assessment. So the whole point is of the field stratification is to make it easier for developers to choose in which strata to sample ecological condition metrics. And at this stage, we also don't accept alternative stratification provided by developers. This might change in the future, but currently we provide this stratification. So once we have provided this field stratification map, developers need to identify some field assessment sites to do their sampling, and they must also justify the selection. So these sites must be selected by developers within specific areas, being at least one in each stratum. So you can see here that they are each in a different color, which corresponds to a different stratum. So more or less risk, more or less close to the forest boundary, and more or less close to the impacted by the forest edge, distance to forest edge. And these areas must be areas identified by the developer as being high risk of deforestation and degradation based on their desktop research. And there must also be sites that are indicative of performance against the project targets, outcomes, and objectives. So all of this is just a quick screenshot of what the PDD section will look like. So they must detail their assessment process. The map will show, and they must justify how they selected the different plots for the field assessment. So this field assessment must be repeated in the same sites used in the baseline assessment at every adaptive management, so at least every 5 years. And developers must also conduct field assessments in additional sites in new areas categorized as high risk by the end of the baseline validity period, which we'll get to in the next few slides. So there might be some new sites that are added up throughout the project crediting period. So we first provide a stratification of the field, a field stratification of the project area. Developers must identify their sites and justify the selection. And once this is done and we have approved the selection, developers must fill out some field assessment surveys on those selected sites. So this is done using our mobile app. So developers go on site, and all the field assessment on each stratum shows up as available surveys to fill out. Whenever they click on a survey, it shows the actual plot on a map and the physical distance to the plot. and developers must enter the plot to then fill out this field assessment survey. So it's a set of different questions that are standardized for all M002 projects across these categories that we previously mentioned. So ecosystem extent, function, threats, services, and developers can input some field text. They can add some observations, whether it's a photo, a video, an audio recording, et cetera, and then they need to do this across each category and then submit the field assessment surveys. So that's pretty much it for the field assessment. And now back to some more methods. So a quick reminder from the first training session on program manual and standard. Developers, if you remind correctly, developers must utilize a theory of change approach to present the project objective and outcomes, as well as to design project intervention and select the indicators and metrics. And developers must regularly monitor and evaluate performance and design. And so based on this and building on this field assessment and the desktop research that developers have done, they must inform the intervention plan, which spans across livelihood interventions, ecological condition interventions. And so this intervention plan, and specifically the ecological condition interventions, fit within this greater approach of theory of change, as explained in the previous training, which you can refer back to if you want to refresh your memory. So this intervention plan must be designed based on the ecological condition baseline, so the field assessment and the desktop research. It must indicate the indicators monitored and reported on at each verification, that will be reported on at each verification, and include some details on the monitoring and methods used. So again, this is just a quick visual of what it would look like in the PDD. So below the ecological condition baseline assessment, you will have the intervention plan detailing what the interventions will be, if there will be any planting activities or not, the seed sourcing pipeline, et cetera, and then an expert assessment of these interventions. This presentation is quite straightforward again, and that is about it for methods. So we can jump into the second poll before leaving some space for questions. I will launch it right away. So the second question is on the purpose of the field assessment under M002. So is it to collect field data on carbon stocks and calibrate the AUDD baseline? Is it solely done to carry out field interviews with communities? Is it done to assess and monitor the ecological condition of the project area, or all of the above? A little bit more time for everybody to get to it. Okay, there's diverging votes. It seems like it wasn't the most clear, but I will end the poll. It is not all of the above. It is, as we mentioned in the previous slide. So this field assessment is not meant to calibrate the AUDD baseline. Right now, under M002, we don't have any calibration module or field calibration module. It is not done to carry out the field interviews, but solely to assess and monitor the ecological condition of the project area. So of course, developers must gather inputs from local communities, indigenous people, and any other relevant stakeholders to inform this assessment. But the actual field assessment itself is only done to assess and monitor the ecological condition across these categories that we mentioned. So ecosystem extent, function, threats, and services. Okay, and now we have some time for questions. I think one came up. So we have a question: what is the purpose for VVB during field assessments? Cross-checking data gathered for defined sites. Please give us an idea. Nothing about the carbon accounting. So exactly as I just mentioned. So as we set the baseline, the ADD baseline, using solely remote sensing technologies, there is no field calibration at this stage. So there is nothing. There's no such thing as like carbon plots or those. I don't know how you, some other methodologies call them like permanent plots for carbon calibration. This is not something that we have. So the purpose of the VVB for the field assessment is effectively checking. So you will have access to the final version of the survey. So the filled out survey with the response from the developer to each question and all the observations. So the photos, the recordings, and it's checking that, all the observations were done on site, that they are properly geolocated, that they all make sense within the greater scheme of the project's target outcomes and objectives. Of course, based on or depending on the length between the time that the developer fills this out on the field and the time that you go on the field to observe this, there might be some change to the condition. Hopefully not that much, but you do have to take into consideration any field changes. So second question that just came up, no field interviews to gather testimonials from local people, is it correct? Yes, so there will be some field interviews. So developers need to carry out the field interviews with local people and local communities, simply that this is not done inside the mobile app as part of the field assessment survey itself. They need to do it to inform the ecological condition baseline, and that's something that you of course need to assess. But it's simply not fully integrated in the field assessment survey questions. It's an external module that they need to coordinate themselves, the developers. And so there will be some that you need to assess, and you can carry out your own independent field interviews with any stakeholders. That is, of course, a very important point to point out. So thank you for this question. Did I answer all your points? All good? Feel free to ask any additional clarification. It seems like it's all good. So moving on to this last subsection before we have a break. Hopefully this will last about 15 minutes, and we can have a 10-minute break and then an hour for part 2. So for requirements specifically related to the carbon pillar, so we'll jump into baseline scenario requirements, as well as key concepts like additionality, leakage, and permanence that you're already familiar with. So for the baseline scenario specifically, so aside from our quantitative baseline setting that we do internally, all developers must establish a qualitative baseline scenario. So this represents, of course, the most plausible land use trajectory in the absence of the project activities. It must be consistent with historical trends and applicable legal and policy frameworks and jurisdictional REP+ strategies. That is quite typical, you're already aware of. And so this baseline scenario, both the qualitative and the quantitative baseline scenario, must be reevaluated at the end of what we call a baseline validity period, also referred to as the BVP, which is a 5-year period from the project's registration date. So every 5 years, this must be reevaluated by both the developers for the qualitative baseline and by us for the quantitative baseline. In terms of the methods, so this baseline scenario, again, is a qualitative one, and developers must identify and analyze any alternative land use scenarios to the proposed project activities. And the periodic reevaluation is meant to assess any impact on potential changes to policies and regulations in the jurisdiction. As we know, this is quite common and can happen regularly. This dual baseline scenario is mainly from a mandatory requirement from ICBCM. And so what we expect from developers is to actively review relevant policies and regulation so that they can best describe what would happen in the project area without the project activities. Quite typical. In terms of additionality, so it is split between 3 main categories. So regulatory surplus, barrier analysis, and common practice. Again, this is nothing quite new. So for the regulatory surplus, developers must demonstrate that there is no enforced legal obligation to implement forest conservation activities. So they must identify any applicable legal, regional, or national legislation, policies, or agreements in force in the project's jurisdiction. That is mandatory for all projects, this first one. In terms of the barrier analysis, so developers must identify all existing barriers that could prevent the implementation of the project activities in the absence of revenues from credits, so equitable carbon units. And at minimum, so there's many different categories, as you may know, so financial barriers, cultural and social barriers, operational barriers, et cetera, At minimum, developers must include a financial barrier analysis as part of the greater barrier analysis. This is the bare minimum that we require. Developers may also fill out additional barrier analyses if they have the additional context and want to submit it. This is not mandatory though, only the financial barrier analysis. A final one that is also mandatory under our methodology is a common practice assessment. So developers must demonstrate that the project is not common practice in the selected geographic region. So I will give a bit more context on this common practice assessment. So it goes in multiple steps. So first of all, developers must define the project activity types. They then need to define a geographic region for the assessment, which at most must align with the national jurisdiction, can be a smaller area as well. They need to identify any comparable activities that are currently active or underway at time of the assessment or during the 10 years prior to the project start date. So this refers back to the first question that was raised at the beginning of the presentation. Developers must then compare project activity type to any identified activities using some comparable attributes. It can be land tenure, funding or access to resources, economic or socio-economic conditions. And then the last 2 steps is to calculate this adoption rate of any similar activities and then determine whether or not each of the project activity types is common practice. So I will give a bit more context on these last 2 steps. So this is just a very simple formula, but the adoption rate for each project activity type will be dependent on the number of similar activities with distinctions from the project activity type and the number of activities identified in that same region that are similar to the project activity type. So this common practice assessment this equation must be done for each identified project activity type. And then the final result is that we get a total adoption rate, and the project is considered to be not common practice and therefore additional if the adoption rate is less than 20%. If there are no similar activities that were identified or exist in the defined geographic region for specific project activity types, the adoption rate is just considered to be set to 0%, and the project is again additional. If the adoption rate is higher or equal to 20%, the project is considered to be common practice in the geographic area, and therefore cannot be considered additional. Might seem a bit complex, but it's quite straightforward when detailed in the PDD. So nothing too tricky. So we have 2 polls coming up now. The first one is we mentioned the baseline validity period in this section, or the BVP. So what does this refer to and what is the duration? I will launch the poll. So as a reminder, this is the frequency at which developers must reevaluate the baseline scenario, and Equitable Earth must reevaluate project baselines. Again, only one response is possible. And it seems like there is good alignment. Getting quite a few votes, but yes, so I will end the poll. The baseline validity period is 5 years. So every 5 years, developers must reevaluate the baseline scenario, qualitative one, and Equitable Earth must reevaluate the quantitative project baseline. Next up, so regarding additionality and specifically barrier analyses, so which one of the following ones must be included to demonstrate additionality? So what is the bare minimum to have and for VVBs to assess? I just launched it. Okay, it seems like I have enough votes. So I will end the poll, and yes, it is financial barrier analysis that must be included to demonstrate additionality. So now on to the last 2 points. I think we're right on time. It's perfect. So as for leakage, so what we do under this version of M002 is that, so us, Equitable Earth, we account for activity shifting leakage resulting from displaced deforestation and degradation activities. And we apply a fixed leakage deduction of 10% to avoid avoided emissions. This is quite market standard, and this is the best that we came up with until we develop a project-based leakage approach. And so in terms of the methods, we predefine potential leakage risks to support the developer's assessment, and then the developers must evaluate those predefined risks, document any gaps, and develop a mitigation plan to mitigate for those leakage risks and report on risk mitigation during each monitoring period. So this is the theory behind it. Daniel, in the second part of the presentation, will show a bit more details on the calculation and how this integrates into the quantification of avoided emissions. As for permanence, we allocate a fixed 20% deduction of verified GHG reductions achieved by each project, and that's to contribute to a shared and common buffer pool. We do this at the time of the issuance of the credits. So beyond this buffer pool contribution to ensure permanence, all reversal risks must be assessed, monitored, and mitigated by the developers. And developers must also put safeguards in place for the long-term permanence of the project in the safeguard section of the PDD. In terms of loss events and reversals, so all loss events must be actively monitored, reported on, and quantified and accounted for. And if a loss event leads to a reversal, credits must be compensated in the equivalent amount through this buffer pool mechanism. And so developers must notify Equitable Earth of any significant loss events within the project crediting area that may trigger reversal classification, and that is beyond our active monitoring of potential loss events. So on to the next couple of polls. I will go ahead and launch it. So how does Equitable Earth quantify activity shifting leakage emission, as we just touched upon? Is it based on a project specific risk? or through a fixed deduction for each project. Okay, it seems like there's again, split results. There's a bit of misalignment, but no, it is not through like based on project specific risks. As mentioned, I will go back to the slide, but it is a fixed leakage deduction of 10% to avoided emissions. So again, we are in the process of considering some projects, so a leakage approach based on project specific risks. But right now we have this fixed leakage deduction of 10% of overall emission reduction. So this is a fixed approach. Let's go back. So I closed this one. And the following one is, what is this fixed activity shifting leakage deduction? What is the amount? We just went back to the slide, so you must have seen it. So nothing too tricky. But yes, it seems like everybody is aligned on this one. So it is a 10% fixed activity shifting leakage deduction. Perfect. So do we have any questions? We have a couple minutes before the break, but we are on track of time. I will check the Q&A section. I will mark the previous ones as answered. I don't see any new ones. Feel free to raise your hand or just unmute yourself if you have any questions. If not, right on time, we have a 10-minute break to freshen up, and we'll be back, depending on your time zone, but at 4 p.m. for me. And we'll let Daniel share his screen and get to the second part of the presentation. So see you in a bit.
Okay, thank you, Corentin.
Thank you.
MZ02. As a reminder, we're still going to be using the different polls throughout the session. So you stay with us during this time. Different to the first part, we're going to have all the questions at the end of this second part. So make sure we'll save enough time at the end to cover all of those. So in the meantime, you can add your questions to the Q&A feature, and then we'll take it from there. So the main focus on the second part of the training is going to be on project boundaries. We're going to explain a little bit how the Monte Carlo simulation works to calculate uncertainty. We'll explain a little bit more about baseline setting, and then we're going to go into carbon accounting, and we'll walk you through some of the different deductions and adjustments that we make, and same for reduction quantification. The last part would be focused on MRV requirements, and at the end, we'll spend some time taking your questions. So getting started with project boundaries. So as Corentin mentioned, in the first part of the training, we already covered geographic and temporal boundaries. So now we're focusing on the project boundaries that are related to the carbon pools are included in the project, as well as the emission sources and sinks considered in the methodology. So starting with emission sinks and sources. So as a principle, projects are monitored for carbon dioxide, and must include additional GHGs unless they are shown to be de minimis. So in the table on the right side, you can see the main gases that are in scope. So we have carbon dioxide, which is mostly coming from flux in carbon pools. We have methane, which is mostly coming from the burning of biomass and livestock grazing. And then we have nitrous oxide that is coming from biomass burning, livestock grazing, and synthetic fertilizer use. We will speak about all of these later. So when it comes to carbon pools that are in scope in this version of the methodology, so you can see on the left side that we're mostly focusing on above ground biomass, HB, and below ground biomass, BGB, in both cases for woody biomass. So we're focusing on these two main carbon pools because they are significant pools in REDD+ projects, and they are the primary sources of emissions from deforestation and degradation. So we estimate HEB accurately using remote sensing, and BGB is estimated from HEB using established root-to-shoot ratios. So in the appendix of the methodology, we have all the different values that are changing depending on the ecosystem, on the location, so feel free to have a look at those there directly. The carbon pools on the right side are currently excluded from the methodology, which are mostly HEB and BGB, specifically the non-woody biomass component. So this is a minor carbon pool in forest ecosystems when it's compared to woody biomass, and there's a lot of temporal variation in this. So this is something that we are not including in this version. In terms of soil organic carbon, there is high measurement uncertainty, even though it can be material in certain ecosystems. And given uncertainty and monitoring complexity, this is something that we're also not including in this version of the methodology, but we might include it later as well of other pools that are currently excluded. Deadwood can be significant after disturbance events. It's also very variable over time, so it's also not included right now. And litter tends to be a minor pool in most tropical and subtropical forests. And given the high turnover rate and low overall carbon stock, this is something that we are not also including in this version of the methodology. As I mentioned, as the methodology continues developed, we might include some of these pools in the future. Now, moving on to Monte Carlo simulation and uncertainty. So this won't be a statistics class, so we are not going to bore you with all of the details behind this, but we want to show you some of the main takeaways for you to understand at a high level our approach. So mostly let's start by briefly discussing what is the Monte Carlo simulation. So it's a type of computational algorithm that uses repeated random sampling to estimate the probability distribution of possible outcomes under uncertainty. So in a nutshell, it's a mathematical technique that predicts possible outcomes of an uncertain event. So with that in mind, on this slide, we have the main principles that we're applying under MS002. So the main concept is that we apply the Monte Carlo simulation to propagate pixel level uncertainty from carbon stocks into project or jurisdiction level emission reductions and estimates, and then apply the uncertainty deduction. So essentially this means that we calculate uncertainty at the pixel level, and then we aggregate the uncertainties of all of the pixels, and then we are able to propagate that to the project area, jurisdiction, and different spatial scales. So the goal of this is to provide a robust and comprehensive probabilistic representation of both jurisdictional baselines and emission reduction estimates with their corresponding uncertainties. So at a very high level, the approach essentially consists of sampling plausible pixel level values from the probability distribution assigned to each parameter. So when I'm talking about here about parameters, this means any of the variables that we want to calculate uncertainty for, which could be, for example, HEB or can be PGB. Then aggregating the sample values from the different sources to calculate the overall values for the area of interest. So as I mentioned, we for the same pixel, we have all the different sources of uncertainty. We calculate each of those for the same pixel, then we combine all the different pixels within the project creating area, and that's what allows us to estimate uncertainty for the entire project creating area. So generally speaking, the Monte Carlo simulation is applied at different stages into the process. So the first one is on the estimation of carbon stocks in the project area, then the estimation of carbon stock for the jurisdictional reference level, which we'll speak about that later, and then the quantification of carbon stock losses for reversals assessment. So when it comes to the actual Monte Carlo simulation, is what you can see here within the green frame. So we are using here an example of AGB to explain you how the process works, but this is the same process for every parameter that we work with. So we receive AGB values. These are coming from our AGB provider, and then each of those values per pixel come with a mean value and an uncertainty value attached to it. So then what we are doing is that our engineering teams is taking those values and they define pixel level probability distributions that then they will use for each iterative sample. So when it comes to the second part, which is the actual iterations, which is in each of the iterations, plausible pixel level values are sampled from the probability distributions, and then the sample pixel values are then aggregated to estimate the total value for the area in that iteration. So this is essentially how the Monte Carlo simulation works. There's a lot of values, a lot of sampling, and then we're able to choose the best probability distribution for each of the pixels that has all the parameters all the way up to the project creating area. So then as a result, so we have the distribution range of the possible values across all the area. Then once we have all of these values, what we do is we sort those values from lowest to highest and then identify the 5th percentile. So the 5th percentile essentially is one value within that distribution, which only 5% of the results fall under. So this is a conservative lower bound that also indicates that 90% confidence that actual emissions are equal or higher to that value. So to calculate the actual uncertainty that will be deducted later on, what we do is we take the mean value of that distribution, we identify the 5th percentile value, and then the difference between those two is what we are actually gonna deduct later on. And this will make a little bit more sense as well once we talk about the quantification part. But before we do that, we have one new poll here. Corentin, you want to trigger that one? So essentially it's about which percentile of the distribution of potential AGB values is used for uncertainty deduction. So we can see the poll is still live. So we have 4 options: 5th percentile, 15th percentile, 50th percentile, or 75th percentile. Corentin, are you able to see the numbers and to see if we have enough?
Yeah, we have 7 votes. We can wait a couple of seconds, but
okay.
Yeah, it seems like most votes are aligned. We're getting a bit more. But yes, correct response. It is the 5th percentile, so I can end the poll.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so let's move on to the next point in part 2, which is AUDT baseline setting of project level baseline. So this won't be a detailed explanation of our baseline setting process, but again, just so you get the high-level information and the main requirements around this. So definitely you can find a lot of details when it comes to baseline setting in the baseline setting module. So generally speaking, baseline setting has 3 main steps that we're going to be talking about throughout this presentation. The first one is on the jurisdictional reference level, what we're calling the JRL. So what is the JRL? So the JRL essentially represents the total emissions from deforestation and degradation within a given jurisdiction, and it is accounted as the total above ground biomass, HB loss, over the historical reference period. So the historical reference period is a look back period that we are using when establishing the JRL, and is 10 years preceding the project start date. So if we have, for example, a project starting in 2024, the historical reference period for that project will be from 2014 to 2024. So how is the GRL built? So essentially, we calculate this using the AGB stock data from our AGB provider, which in this case is Chloris Geospatial. And then this information is really valuable because the GRL reflects observed estimates of AGB loss based on historical changes. So it's looking at what were the main changes in biomass over the past 10 years and is deriving an emissions value for the entire jurisdiction based on that. And it doesn't rely on land cover classification, which is one of the main elements here. So as an output of this, so we have that these values, which again are the pixel-based biomass loss over the 10-year historical reference period, are serve as the input for the risk model and defines the emissions budget for the jurisdiction that then will be allocated to projects via the risk mapping process, which we will explain in a second how that works. Now, just so you have an idea of what the actual GRL could look like. So this is just one example. But for example, you can see here, we have a map of a sample jurisdiction. So what this map is showing us is the biomass change in this given jurisdiction over a 10-year period. So we can see on like different colors in this map, we can see that green shows where in this jurisdiction biomass has increased over time, and then in red we can see where biomass has decreased over the historical reference period. So if you see, for example, there are going to be areas where there's a lot of red spots, and they're more intense in that sense, which means that has been more forest loss in that area compared to more greener areas. So this is how a summary essentially of all the changes over 10 years. Now, if we look at how this map is being built, so we look at the start point and the end point of the historical reference period. So in a project started in 2024, which is going to be the end of the historical reference period, we have that the start point would be 2014. So what we are seeing here is two different maps for the same jurisdiction. On the left side, you can see the values of carbon stocks at the beginning, and then on the right side, you can see the value stocks are the end of the historical reference period. So we can see, for example, that when we compare both images, in both cases, the green color means higher biomass. So intense green means a lot of biomass. So lighter green means less biomass, and zero essentially means no biomass, which is reflected in white. So if you compare both images, you can see that some areas, I'm not sure if you can actually see my mouse here, but on the left side map, we see more greener areas. And when we look at the right side map, we see more whitish areas pretty much spread throughout. So this essentially shows that when you take into account these 2 points, you can definitely quantify using remote sensing the losses in AGB, which again, this is the start and the end of the historical reference period. And this image that I showed you previously is showing that over the entire 10-year period. Now, moving on to the second step of AUGD baseline setting is about risk mapping. So essentially the risk mapping process creates a risk map tailored to a specific jurisdiction using our risk model. So essentially, at a glance, risk maps are generated for each jurisdiction that we're working in using a computer vision model. So for simplicity, we're calling this the risk model, essentially that predicts future deforestation and degradation for that given jurisdiction for the baseline validity period of 5 years. So this model is trained on multiple data sets. We're including here one example. So the model includes like fixed data sets, but also includes supplementary layers to the model, such as the Alpha Earth's foundations data sets from Google DeepMind, which are incorporated into the model to capture more accurately the drivers of deforestation. We can include some topography information there as well. So we can add more variables in order to make the predictions more accurate. So important to mention that the same risk model is used to develop all risk maps for all the different jurisdictions. So it's the same model, but each jurisdiction has its own risk map that is going to be then used for allocating the project level baselines, which we're going to speak about that in a second. So when it comes to risk mapping, it's quite complex from the technical point of view. And as I mentioned before, you can, if you're interested in this topic, you can review all of these details in the baseline setting module. But at a high level, we split risk mapping into two main sub-processes. So the first one is model development, and the second one is model application. So under the model development phase, so the risk model is defined and fine-tuned to identify what are the best hyperparameters that work for the model. Then we evaluate the performance of the model by evaluating the predictions of the model against with observed data. And based on that, we're able to choose what are the best hyperparameters that are able to reflect the reality. Then this is done for all jurisdictions at the same time. But then when we're going to talk about specific jurisdictions and then on the project level, what we do is we take the same hyperparameters during the first model development phase and then train the same model, but now on a specific jurisdiction, which is what is going to allow us to see and forecast deforestation and degradation on that specific jurisdiction and produce a risk map accordingly. So with that in mind, we're showing you here an example, which is a forecast of biomass loss across a given jurisdiction over the 5 years baseline validity period. So you can see on this map for this sample jurisdiction, we have non-eligible areas that you can see here in pinkish, maroonish, which essentially are non-eligible areas as explained by Corentin in the first part. And then we can see here in the jurisdiction that we have different colors. So for the baseline validity period, blue means that is very low biomass is predicted to be lost due to deforestation and degradation. And then we go into more the yellow and red territory. That means a higher risk of deforestation and degradation based on the historical reference period. And this is a prediction that is made for the next 5 years of the baseline validity period. Okay, and then the last step of baseline setting is the project baseline allocation. So essentially, this allocation process uses the output from the risk model and the risk mapping process as previously shown. And what it does is that it distributes the JRL to the project areas using a scaled allocation mode. So at a high level concept, we have that emissions are distributed in proportion to the model risk of the future biomass loss, ensuring that all eligible areas receive emissions according to their risk level. So that means, for example, if we take a look at the previous maps, and we saw that some areas are predicted to have higher biomass loss risk than others, for example, here in yellow and orange and red. So those areas within the project area are going to receive a higher baseline, higher emissions compared to other areas where the risk is lower. So it is proportional. Important to mention as well that the biomass allocation per pixel is constrained to the carbon stock available in that pixel. So we can, of course, we can't allocate more than what the pixel has in terms of biomass. And this helps a lot with integrity of the overall approach because the JRL is at the jurisdictional level is acting as a firm cap on the total emissions available for allocation, and allocated emissions must not exceed it. So let's say, for example, that we have a given jurisdiction and has calculated the JRL and is 200, just to give you a random number. So that 200 can be allocated to the different projects within the same jurisdiction, and none of those projects, all the projects combined, can exceed that cap. So this is an important safeguard that we've introduced to essentially prevent over allocation, prevent over crediting, and ensuring generally high integrity approach. One last thing to mention here is that allocation is only applied to pixels with non-zero biomass stock and constrained to pixels with a forest mask, of course, which is part of what Corentin already mentioned on eligibility. So how does that look like in practice? So on this area here, so what we have is an overlay of the project area that you can see here in yellow polygons with the forecasted biomass loss across the jurisdiction over the baseline validity period. So you will see three main colors here. We can see blue here, that essentially means that for that specific baseline validity period of 5 years, for that specific project, we are not forecasting any risk of deforestation or degradation, or at least the risk is very low. These you're going to see here in blue. In red, you can see where the risk is high. And in between those, you can see where the risk level is moderate. So if you look at the project area, we are going to see different parts of this that are blue, which means that there is no risk of biomass, but you're going to see biomass loss. But then you're going to see some areas where we can see more red dots, or we can see more white dots, which means that the risk of biomass loss to deforestation and degradation is actually higher. So those parts of the project are going to receive a higher emissions of those pixels compared to others where the risk level is higher. Also, we're including other things here, just so you know. We have some exclusion zones. We have some existing forest carbon projects that are also being excluded as part of the eligibility criteria. But yeah, the main focus here is on the yellow area and everything that is here in there. Now, to sum up, because this is probably a lot, so essentially we have three main steps for AUD baseline setting at Equitable Earth. So we firstly have a historical reference period of 10 years that through remote sensing, we are able to calculate the jurisdictional reference level for a given jurisdiction. This is going to be the budget that we have to distribute downstream for project allocation and nesting within the JRL. Then we have the second step, which is risk mapping. So it's using a model that integrates different layers to produce jurisdiction-specific risk maps. And within those specific risk maps, we're going to allocate those emissions to project level baselines based on the level of risks determined through that risk map. So for example, if you have one area within that jurisdiction, the risk map that is showing as higher risk of biomass loss, then that project is going to receive a higher baseline that you can see here in more greenish, in more orange, reddish colors. And then we have a lower baseline that would be attributed to projects that are within the part of the jurisdiction that is not predicted to be at risk, or it's a lower risk compared to the first project. So let's see if you're still with us after all this talking. So we have a new poll. Corentin, can you please put it up? So essentially is, what is the duration of the historical reference period used to generate the jurisdictional reference level? So we have 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, or 20 years.
Yeah, most people have voted, I think. If not all, but yes, I will close it. It is indeed 10 years. So everybody's aligned on this response.
Okay, great. Thank you. Now we can move on to the carbon accounting part. Let's start with some deductions and adjustments. So one of the main things that we're going to be talking about here is about project emissions, which essentially consists of emissions from forest biomass loss and or emissions from project activities, as you can see here on the equation. So any project emissions observed during a given monitoring period must be deducted from the baseline emissions. So this is one of our requirements. So the equation has two main components: emissions from forest biomass loss and emissions from project activities. And we're going to go deeper into each of those, starting with emissions from forest biomass loss. So emissions from carbon stock changes attributed to deforestation and forest degradations within the project area is what we are including here. So that can be anything such as forest fires, grass fires, anthropogenic clearing, logging, or any natural events that are affecting biomass. So we are able to quantify this using remote sensing, and then we're able to deduct this from the baseline directly. So for this, we don't require any additional input from developers. And this is something that, we quantify by comparing carbon stock values between successive observation periods. Now, the other element of project emissions is emissions from project activities. So this essentially means that we are quantifying emissions associated to activities implemented throughout the project that are not being captured through the emissions from forest biomass loss. So there are multiple emission sources that are included here. We'll talk about all of those in the next slides. Important thing here to remember is that the total emissions for each monitoring period are calculated as the sum of all the relevant project activity emission sources. So in all of these cases, Equitable Earth is gonna do the quantification of these emissions, but we will need inputs from developers depending on what the source is, and we're gonna explain that in a second. And at the end, all of this depends on whether these emissions are material or not. So which is a new concept that we are introducing in M002. So only applicable for emissions from project activities, we have introduced a materiality assessment into the approach, which essentially we applied a materiality threshold of 1% of the total estimated gross emission reductions for a given baseline validity period of 5 years. And this is something that we are doing. So the first time we do it early into the project, so at feasibility and design stages, and then we reassess materiality every 5 years in alignment with the baseline validity period and adaptive management. So essentially, based on this materiality rule, we can have two different scenarios. So we have a first scenario where project activity emissions are material, which means that if any of the project activities are equal or exceeding the 1% threshold, then that means that those emissions are material, which means that they need to be reported in the annual report and the monitoring report. In this case, we're going to be making the corresponding deductions from the project's gross emission reductions. Now, it can also happen that project activity emissions are not going to be material, and this happens when the emissions are lower than the materiality threshold that we have established here, which means that these emissions are going to be considered de minimis, and they won't be reported and they won't be quantified until the next baseline validity period, which is when we're doing the materiality reassessment. So again, a very important concept to remember, but this is only relevant for project activity emissions. Now, moving on to the specific project activity emissions. If you might have seen already on M002, we have sub-equations for each of the different project activities, but for now, we're going to focus only on this main equation that contains the main project activities that are in scope of M002. So project activities essentially include emissions from biomass burning, which is the first element that you can see here in the equation. So if after the materiality assessment, we determine that emissions from biomass burning are material, then we're going to proceed with the quantification of total CO2 and non-CO2 emissions from HEB burning for a given monitoring period. but we will require data from developers to complete the quantification. So in case biomass burning is part of the activities and their emissions, we are going to require developers to submit for all the fire events occurring within the monitoring period. We need them to provide a unique identifier for each fire event, an estimation of the burned area, and the start and end dates of each of the burning events. So based on this information, we will be able to quantify emissions from biomass burning as part of project activities. The second project activity that is relevant here are emissions from livestock grazing. So we have some projects where grazing from livestock can be a project activity, and we quantify these for both the project area and the project origin area if these emissions are material, based on the materiality assessment that I just explained. So we quantify the total emissions from livestock grazing for a given monitoring period using default factors from the IPCC, which essentially include different factors for different species, different categories of livestock, which change also depending on the country. So we welcome you to review all of the details in one of the appendixes of NC02 if you want to see all the different default factors that we're using there. Now, in this case, in case of materiality, we're going to ask developers to quantify within the project area and within the project origin area the annual average number of head of livestock species per category, and then they need to report this information on a yearly basis for each year within the monitoring period that is going under certification. And the last element here is going to be focused on emissions from the use of synthetic fertilizer as part of project activities. So we quantify emissions from synthetic fertilizer use application within the project area and also within the project origin area when these emissions are material. So Equitable Earth quantifies the total emissions for a given monitoring period, and we distinguish between direct and indirect emission sources, and the sub-equations related to that you can also see in detail in the NC02. In this case, these emission sources are material. We require developers to provide the quantity of synthetic nitrogen fertilizer applied within the project area and within the project origin area per year, and they also need to report the nitrogen content of the fertilizer use. Okay, so moving on to activity shifting leakage. As Corentin mentioned during part one, we applied a 10% default factor, which is applied to avoided forest loss emissions. So here we say that the cumulative emissions from leakage are fixed from the first monitoring period onwards, so we will always be applying the same deduction. There are two main elements in the activity shifting leakage emissions equation. So we firstly have on the left side, we have the baseline emissions and the emissions from forest biomass loss. So we deduct the emissions from forest biomass loss from the baseline, and this is going to be the avoided forest loss emissions. And then to that number, we apply the leakage factor, which is in this case 0.1, which is equivalent to the 10% that we already mentioned, to be able to quantify emissions from activity shifting leakage for the project. Moving on to the uncertainty deduction, as mentioned earlier when explaining Monte Carlo simulation, so we identify the 5th percentile from the distribution, and then we ensure a conservative estimate with a 95% probability that the actual emission values are equal to or higher than the calculated values. And that number is going to be reflected here in this first term that we're showing you in the equation, which is going to be the difference between the mean of the distribution and the 5th percentile. So that number, we're going to plug that in here, and it's going to be applied to the different elements and the different sources of emissions at the project level. So the second element that we're going to be including as part of the uncertainty deductions is uncertainty related to the project AUDT baseline. We are also going to include deductions related to the project emissions, which, as a reminder, includes emissions from forest biomass loss and emissions from project activities. And we're also going to deduct the total emissions from activity shifting leakage. So, time for a new poll. This time, we would like to ask you what materiality threshold as a percentage of the total gross emission reductions determines whether project activity emissions must be accounted for. Can you trigger that current time, please?
Yeah, it's active.
Great, thank you. So we have 4 options. So 1% or higher, 5% or higher, 10% or higher, or no threshold.
Getting in some votes. It seems like most people are aligned. So yes, it is 1% or higher. So we can close this one.
Thank you. Sounds good. We now have another poll for you, which is about what project activity emissions are considered under M002. So we see that the poll is open. So we have livestock grazing, burning of biomass, use of synthetic fertilizer, or all of the above.
Again, it seems like most people are aligned, getting still some votes, but yes, it is all of the above. So livestock grazing, burning of biomass, and use of synthetic fertilizer. Thank you for responding.
Great, thank you. Okay, let's jump into the next 2 sections of part 2. So starting with emission reduction quantification. So essentially, gross emission reductions are emission reductions for a given monitoring period that accounts for all the applied adjustments without including the buffer pool contribution. We're going to speak about that in a second. So essentially, gross emission reductions is going to include the project baseline. And from this, we're going to deduct total project emissions. We are going to deduct total emissions from activity shifting leakage. And we're also going to deduct uncertainty deduction that, as I mentioned previously, includes all the different elements there. Last but not least, so we have the net emission reductions, which in the context of M002, we have the net emission reductions is equivalent to the ECUs from AUDT activities after all of the deductions. And essentially what we're going to be doing here is we take the gross emission reductions that we previously calculated, and we're going to deduct the buffer pool contribution that, as Corentin mentioned, we're talking about permanence on the part 1 of this training. So Equitable Earth allocates 20% of the verified GHG reductions achieved by each project to the buffer pool at the time of ECU issuance. And the last section, so this is going to be quick here to also give you some time for answering questions. It's going to be focused on MRV. So the methodology has requirements for both Equitable Earth and for developers. So Equitable Earth is responsible for monitoring and reevaluating the project baseline every 5 years in alignment with the baseline validity period. We're also responsible for monitoring biomass carbon stock losses within the project rating area. And we are also responsible for monitoring project activity emissions that are considered material. On the developer side, they are also responsible for monitoring all the metrics, parameters, and indicators that have been included in the monitoring plan and also related to project activities when those are material. In terms of reporting, so we have on the Equitable Earth side, so we are responsible for producing the GHG monitoring report that consolidates the results of the net GHG reductions achieved during the verification period, which I'm pretty sure you're already very well versed on this based on the previous training. And on the developer side, we're going to require them to produce annual reports for reporting on all the metrics, all the parameters, and all the indicators of activities undertaken over the last 12 months. And we'll also require them to aggregate all of the different annual report information into the monitoring report before each verification. So the most important thing for you here is that only the GHG monitoring report produced by Equitable Earth and the monitoring report produced with the developer information are the ones that are going to be verified by the VVB. And one last thing before we jump into questions is about adaptive management. This is as a reminder because you already saw this in your previous training. So developers need to update the PDD every 5 years after the registration date, which is also aligned with the baseline validity period and the materiality reassessment. So with that, we can enter into questions if you got any at this point. Let's see the Q&A. I don't have any questions here just yet. But if you have any questions on any of the previous sections, feel free to raise your hand. Yes, Juan.
Hi, Daniel. I have a question related to this last part you mentioned about verifying the GHG report, which, if I understood correctly, is developed by Equitable Earth, right? Should the BBB verify the estimations and calculations of Equitable Earth?
Corinne, you want to take this one?
I can. So as we've mentioned throughout the presentation, so we produce we get the AUDD baseline data from our data providers, and then we plug these into some rather complex algorithms and code, and then that gives us the baseline. And then based on all the information provided by the developer, we input all these deductions that we also plug into the code and the algorithm, and then that's then pulled directly into the GHG monitoring report. So where it's a bit tricky is that we ask for a full assessment of the GHG monitoring report, but rather basic assessment of making sure that all the numbers make sense, that all the math adds up in between all the equations, and that all that the materiality assessment was done, that all the necessary project emissions were included, et cetera, et cetera. So we do ask for this kind of assessment, but given that we don't provide the raw data because we currently are not able to provide the full raw data nor an open source algorithm, we don't request to actually assess the numbers themselves, but rather that they match between themselves and that the whole report is comprehensive and makes sense. So I agree that it's a bit of a tricky system, and we are we're currently trying to find a way to transparently share all of those elements. But in the end, as part of the contracting that we have with VVBs and with the developers, we are liable on the calculations because we have decided as an organization to bring everything in-house and do everything in. So we are liable for those results. So we do ask for a completeness check, but not for an actual check of the numbers themselves.
Okay, understood. Thanks.
Of course. Yeah, José Luis, feel free to speak up whenever you have.
Yes. And what about the monitoring report from developers? What about ecological conditions where these kind of issues are dealt?
So this is currently, as I mentioned, I think in the previous training session, this is currently shown as two different reports, but this will be delivered as one report. So the monitoring report, which is filled by the developer, and the GHG monitoring report is a subsection or is an appendix to the monitoring report. So in the core of the monitoring report, this is where the developer will be reporting on all the metrics and indicators and performance on all the ecological condition interventions, as well as the livelihood interventions and any other interventions that are mentioned in the PDD. So that's how it's built. So this is fully meant to be assessed by the VVB, and every single thing needs to be checked for completeness. And then for the GHG report, the second part of that monitoring report, what I just explained to Juan Carlos.
Okay. Thank you.
Of course. Do we have any other questions? Again, this has been a lot of content. We're aware of this, and we'll be sending the recording. And if there are additional questions that come up, you can always feel free to send an email, like to aggregate a document and send us an email if there's anything that is still unclear after you've rewatched or read the slides. And we're happy to answer this asynchronously. But let me check the Q&A section as well if there's any new questions, but it doesn't seem like it. All good. Daniel, do you want to go to the conclusion if we don't have any questions?
Yep, sounds good.
So as a quick conclusion, so this is just reiterating what we covered. So basic eligibility criteria, general requirements across ecological condition and the carbon pillars. And then in the second part, we mentioned more so the GHG quantification of M002 projects. So again, we're aware that this might be heavy content. I think in general, it just needs to be implemented. You need practice over the first few audits, and then it will come naturally. But this is nothing meant to be tricky. Everything else, I mean, all of this is further detailed in the M002 documents available on the website, and any additional procedures like the baseline setting module, for example, which we highly encourage to read for further context. And so that's pretty much it. We thank you for your participation. We hope this was more or less interactive and captivating. And in terms of next steps, if you want to move to the next, it's okay. We don't necessarily need this content, but for the next steps, we will be sending the knowledge test. So there will likely be two different ones, one on the first training session, which I haven't sent yet because I wanted to send a full package, but there will be one on general program manual and standard requirements, and then a knowledge test on M002. So as you're well aware, this test needs to be passed by all lead auditors with a passing score of 80% or above to make sure that all lead auditors are qualified. The test can be taken as many times as needed, so there's no stress, no rush. It's also, of course, fully open book. You can read, you can have the document on the side, but of course, we just want to make sure that you have full understanding of everything we've covered in the training session. So once we receive those tests, we will issue those certificates of completion to each lead auditor that passed the test. And then the contract, this is more overarching and it's grayed out because so as part of the new procedure, the new validation verification procedure, that will be out hopefully by the end of this week after a month of working on it. We also updated the VVB agreement. So we will coordinate this with probably you, Jose Luis, and Luis Javier, to have this new contract revised and signed between both parties. And once all of this is done, we will change the status of ANOR on the website to an active status with an M002 methodology scope. So, and then it's the ... because it depends when we're able to assign a mandate, hopefully in the next couple months. And so then we can sync again on the actual mandate, coordinating the mandate and sharing some invoice. But those are the next steps. So very short term, hopefully by next week, I can share the knowledge test, and you can pass it around for completion. This is about it. After this session, I will also send you the recording, of course. I will send you the feedback form as well that we already sent after the first session. If you have any additional comments on this specific session or anything that came up on the mix or like the bundle of the two sessions. Again, this is for us to improve on the delivery of our sessions and improve the content or the format. So that's pretty much it. We're right on time, 5 minutes if there's any final questions. Otherwise, we can end it here. And we thank you all for coming and for your active participation.
Thank you so much, Corentin. Nothing
Pleasure.
else from my side. So thank you. We will be grading the knowledge test next week in order to proceed with them and achieve the certificate, achieve the final active status. Okay, this is the target.
Yes, of course. Hopefully this happens quite quickly. So
yes, I hope so.
And I will be in touch with you for the new version of the procedure. So it will be out on the website, but I'll make sure to send it to you by email so that you have a notification of it being uploaded.
Perfect.
So thank you all. Enjoy the rest of your day, afternoon, evening, wherever you are in the world, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.